Welcome to the Therapy Corner. Here on the Therapy Corner, what we try to do is educate, enlighten, and demystify about all things psychological in nature. Today, we have a very special guest. This is Denis Flores. And Denis Flores comes all the way to us from Spain at this moment, where he's living. He has a very distinguished resume. He has been working in the field of psychology for many, many years. He spent actually 20 years in the military as a psychologist. While living in Australia, he created the public firm, Career Focus, and which offered psychological assessment, organizational development, executive coaching, and career transition. He also established the Institute of Psychological Practice in 2003, which provided curriculum and supervision for psychology graduate interns. Since then, he has been working rather diligently and very impressively on putting together research and on resilience and coming up with what's called the Adult Resilience Scale, which is what we'll be talking about today, resilience and his resilience scale, the measurement of resilience and how it impacts us as people. So again, welcome, Denis. Welcome to our show, and so nice to have you here.
My pleasure.
Okay, so first off, how did you come to develop this resilience scale? What prompted you to start it?
I was consulting to corporations in Melbourne and internationally, mostly doing psychometric assessment for large-scale recruitment. And my clients were railways, construction firms, mining companies, and we were specializing in selection for safety-related roles. So, for example, in railways, we recruited train drivers for suburban and interstate rail. And all of these were to be assessed using safety-related psychometric assessments. There was one in particular called Situational Awareness Scale. And as a result of that, and because of my previous experience with the military, which incidentally included 4 years with SAS, selecting special forces, it then developed into looking at something beyond situational awareness on a more comprehensive scale, and that was resilience. So I was at the time lecturing at university as well as in practice. I had access to any number of PhD students who were doing their internship with me or my institute. And so I had access to good quality research. And over a period of about 2 years, we developed the scale, narrowed it down to the number of items, and determined what the dimensions would be. And we had, obviously, because we were doing large-scale recruitment, we had access to any number of participants. So, for example, I was running an assessment centre every month for the suburban rail network in Melbourne, and I had 24 or 25 candidates at each one. And during the process, we asked them if they would volunteer to do the resilience scale, which they did. And so we were able to collate almost 500 subjects. And so we developed the test that way. Now, when I then sold that and moved on and moved to Malta, I was lecturing at the university in organizational psychology through some context, and again had access to any number of university students. So we got permission to administer the scale to first and second year psychology students and students from other faculties to develop an international database. So we had an Australian database of almost 500, and then a Maltese database of about 130, 140 or something like that. And then with my colleague at the University of Malta, we did some comparison studies. So we had a cross-cultural study where we were looking at the differences in resilience between an Australian international group and a Maltese group. We also did an interesting comparison because we had the data from the assessment centres. We had information on a range of skills and aptitudes that were part of the selection process. And they included the NEO 5-factor personality scale, mechanical reasoning, and a whole range of other assessments. And over a period of about 2 years, we developed the results of that and published it. And if I can say, the most significant finding we had with the resilience scale then was that there, as you can imagine, there was a negative correlation between resilience and neuroticism as part of the NEO, and a positive correlation with conscientiousness. There were some others, but generally speaking, that was what we were finding. So we had a scale that we knew was valid and reliable. We had done all the item analysis. Not only was it valid and reliable, it was consistently measuring what other assessments were measuring. We also had a very large cross-cultural database. And so I wanted to take this a step further and built a website to market the test at any one time. So that's what they built. And as a result, we entered into a worldwide open-ended royalty agreement 2 years ago, or 18 months ago. And I provided the scale, the items. I wrote a manual and created 2 different reports, a coach's report and an individual's report. And all of this is now available online through ACER internationally. A little bit further, since then, I became aware of a conference in Ukraine on the psychology of crisis states. And as a result of negotiations with the conference organisers at the university in Kiev, my colleague from ACER in Australia and I presented at this conference last week online. 1,300 participants registered online. Wow. And it was amazing. It was really, it went over for 3 days. And we had a 3/4 of an hour, half-hour presentation, and on the assessment, on the scale and how it was developed and what it measures and so on. And now all of that material from the whole conference is to be published by the university and made available to libraries and to veterans associations and so on. And the last and most exciting element of all of that, of the resilience scale as it stands now, is that about a month ago, I was contacted by one of my network colleagues, who is a psychologist in Tehran, in Iran. Oh. And she works with Afghan refugees in an acculturation program, assisting particularly adolescents to assimilate to their new environment and to assist them to work through the conditions that they had been subjected to over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Now, that's developed to the point where we are now seeking grants to conduct some research. We're looking to test 150 to 200 participants who we've defined as Afghan adolescents who spent a significant period of time in Afghanistan and then were evacuated and are now refugee status. They will do the assessment, and we will develop a resilience retreat program where we can assist them with counselling and use that information, that data, for a rehabilitation program in Iran and wherever else they may end up. Now, that's in its formative stages. That's about as far as we've got at the moment. And we're trying to get some support because we just can't do it on our own. We need an institute or a university or somewhere to support that. Yeah, and that's where it's got to. The scale is now published. It's worldwide. I haven't seen terribly much in the way of purchases just yet because it's only just started. But yeah, next year that should be going quite well.
Wow, that's an impressive story you just related there. That's amazing, the amount of work and effort you've put into this thing. I feel the need to go back, forgive me for this, to go back and say, what are we defining resilience as? When you say resilience, what are you saying?
The abstract that we presented to the last conference included this definition. And forgive me, but I'll read it because it's what was published. Resilience is defined as the ability of adults in otherwise normal circumstances who are exposed to an isolated and potentially highly disruptive event, such as the death of a close relative or a life-threatening situation, to maintain relatively stable, healthy levels of psychological and physical functioning. Now, a lot of people have extended that, and our model includes a recovery definition. A lot of people have extended that to say, well, it's not just maintaining the capacity to perform, but it is recovering to the point where you have overcome the trauma that the circumstances created. In the presentation, a previous speaker talking about resilience in the recent conference in Ukraine said that you cannot return to normality because the events that created the trauma still exist and still exist within you. And so what we were discussing then is the rationale of how you work through the model to encourage the individual to come to terms with what has happened and use their skills and their particular capacities, both behavioural and mental and emotional, to balance that trauma and to work forward. If I can digress just a little bit, and I don't think you've got this graphic, but in the presentation we use a slide of a seagull with a lizard in its mouth, and the seagull's beak is wide open and it is separated by the two hind legs of the lizard, whose tail and mouth are hanging out on either side of the seagull's beak. And we use the analogy of an analogy from nature. At what stage does the lizard realize that he's in deep trouble? And this is the threat perception of the 5 dimensions. And at what point does he then say, well, I'm going to use all of my strengths, all of my experience to overcome this problem? And that's why he's got both his hind legs keeping the bird's beak apart. And we use that as an analogy to say, well, you identify what strengths you have that can counterbalance the issues that you've been dealing with, and so on and so on. So it's an analogy that works very well graphically when you're doing presentations. Yeah.
No, that's an excellent analogy. I love it. I like to think in pictures sometimes, and that's a picture that you have there. You were talking there about the threat perception. You mentioned 5 stages in your, or 5 dimensions, I should say, 5 dimensions in your resiliency scale. Would you mind going over those? The threat perception, adjustment,
I'll go through them,
coping, and recovery.
I'll use the definitions.
Oh, excellent.
Yep. The first is threat perception. This is the perceptive ability or situational awareness. Now, remember, my interest in this whole subject came from measurement of situational awareness, both in military candidates and in safety awareness, safety operational candidates. So threat perception is the perceptive ability or situational awareness of a potential or actual problem or threat, and the ability to formulate a plan to continue. In other words, being aware of the situation and noticing problems when they arise. Now, before I go on to the next one, you will see many people that do not have that threat perception. They do not understand when things are not working particularly well. And it can be in such a simple thing as interpersonal communication. So one person might be saying something about another and lacking any emotional intelligence doesn't understand how that communication is being perceived by the other person. So they're not really understanding what's going on around them. And this is the beginning of the basis of threat perception, being aware of what's going on around you. The second of the dimensions is adjustment. And that's the ability to adjust when unexpected events cause disruption. The assessment of recovery options, and remember the lizard with his 2 legs apart, he's assessing what can I do here. If I let go, I'm going to be chomped. But if I keep using my strengths, and be they emotional, mental, or physical strengths, I'll overcome this. So assessment of recovery options, flexibility and openness to new circumstances. In other words, being flexible and open to new circumstances, recognizing when a new approach to a problem is needed. Now, again, if I can give you an analogy from an eminent psychologist, do you remember Dr. Edward de Bono, who was a Maltese psychologist and the inventor of creative thinking?
Mm.
You remember?
Yeah.
He used to say things like, if you are drilling for oil and there's no oil, there's no point in drilling any deeper. You have to drill somewhere else.
Right.
So this is, again, a relation to being open to new circumstances. So the third dimension is decision making. The ability to make clear decisions during stressful situations, making good decisions under pressure, assessing the available options and choosing the one that is most conducive to recovering from the problem. And again, this goes back to the military days with the SAS. You are going to be in circumstances where you are on your own. You have to think and you will not have support from anywhere else. So you have to make clear and well-considered, well-constructed decisions. The next one is coping. And this is the capacity to deal with difficult issues as they arise and to put stressful events into perspective. The operation of one's recovery coping mechanisms and accepting that a change in approach or strategy is required, so the stressful events are less likely to have a negative impact. So this is enacting the chosen option and applying the chosen actions to the problem at hand. And this is, again, related to something like the power of positive thinking, always thinking about what's possible rather than why things can't happen. So it's a coping capacity. It's a very well-known psychological construct. It's nothing new. Yeah. And the last one is recovery. This is the speed of return to normal activity after challenging situations. In other words, regaining strength and resilience after the problem is dealt with. So they're the 5 dimensions that my scale measures.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, as you were talking, it occurred to me, especially because you've mentioned the military and your original work there with the military and the special forces. I can certainly, I was in the Army way back when, let's not go there. But I can certainly see the need for doing resiliency testing for special forces because of the need to have people in those positions who have a high degree of resilience. That just makes perfect sense. How do you see this tool applicable to, I'm going to say, other occupations or endeavors that you might engage in life?
Let me say that before I left Australia, I ran a seminar on the scale and a 2-day workshop, basically. And we invited people that I knew, colleagues that I knew from the firefighting world and from the military. And even then, now we're talking about 10 years ago, maybe 2010, 2009, 2010, the Australian Army were developing resilience training for recruits, not just SAS, but all recruits. And the US military were doing the same. Oh. And I had 2 of my colleagues at that seminar, one from St. Petersburg in Russia and one from Helsinki in Finland, and both of them indicated that resilience training of a sort that we were discussing at the time was either contemplated or in practice as part of the preparation for soldiers to be fully qualified. Now, if you take that a step further, you can look at a whole range of safety-related and dangerous occupations like first responders. If you think about the dreadful time that first responders went through when the Twin Towers came down, they continued for days and days without rest to keep going in the face of physical harm, emotional trauma, but they kept going. And I experienced something similar, although not of the same magnitude. When I was a firefighter in Australia for 5 years. During that time, there were a major series of bushfires where, not far from where I lived, in fact, my patrol was sent out, we were on operational service. 200 people died. And hundreds of hectares of land were burnt out. So if you don't have the resilience to be able to cope with that, post-traumatic stress becomes a major issue, because you're dealing with something that you went through that you didn't realize was affecting you at the time. So any of those types of roles where there's a significant amount of stress that they have to be, police patrolling the streets even, particularly where there's a high crime rate. They may well be under some threat by somebody with a weapon, but they have to maintain their coping capacity. They have to make the decisions very, very quickly, and the right decisions, otherwise people die. So their scope in all of those sorts of occupations. Now, some of my colleagues in Australia, one in particular, has taken this a step further, and without going into detail, because it's not mine, they have developed what they call resilience at work, where colleagues at work can do an assessment, and there's a comparison, so that we're talking now about building resilient organisations. So not only are they financially resilient and physically resilient, but they have people who are able to deal with the out of ordinary problems to keep the business successful. So again, there's a potential for, and well, not just potential, it's being done now, and has been done for the last 4 or 5 years, where you're building resilient organisations as well.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting as you were talking, and you mentioned police work and first responders and that sort of thing. And from 1976 to 81, I worked as a psychologist with the LA County Sheriff's Department here in California. And we did a longitudinal study of success in law enforcement using the MMPI, Minnesota Multi-Phasic Personality Inventory, as a test to see if it would show success in law enforcement. And what we found was there was absolutely no correlation. I wished we had had your scale back then. It probably would have been a lot better for us than using the MMPI, because the personality inventory didn't help us at all in determining success in law enforcement. But I could certainly see where your particular scale would have been a tremendous asset in determining whether someone should be in law enforcement or not.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because I was an Army psychologist at the time, and working in Army headquarters in Canberra, and there was a request from my seniors to look at the age level and the physical requirements of military police to see whether or not that we should continue with that. They were having a significant amount of trouble getting the right sort of and the right number of recruits for military police. We did some research, probably looking at the same material you were looking at, only to find out that the successful police operators were not necessarily 6 foot tall and toothpick handles across, which is what we were using as a criteria in the first place. But in fact, it was attitude, and it was the capacity, right? The capacity to make decisions. So I actually wrote a paper for my superiors, my colonel, and I was very pleased that it was actually adopted. They changed the regulation, so now we have military police who are 5'4", not 6'2", but their effectiveness is determined by the way they approach the problem, not because they're big, tall, and bullies. So yes, it reminded me of that too.
Yeah, no, it's sort of interesting. We get these preconceived notions, I believe, on what type of individual would work best in any given situation, and unfortunately, our stereotypes don't necessarily match reality.
No, that's true. That's true. And I spent 5 years in the fire brigade, in 3 different brigades because I moved. But the camaraderie was what kept those people together. The ability to work together, the ability to understand each other. So we're talking about characteristics quite different from physical capacity and even intellectual capacity. You know, there wasn't necessarily that correlation. It was a matter of attitude and how you work together. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, well, I trust you will continue in your efforts here to promote this scale and your work. It certainly makes good sense to me. I became interested in resilience back when I happened to be looking at TED Talks when they first started coming out, and there was a marvelous little TED Talk that I think she was a grammar school teacher, gave on resilience, and she felt that we should teach resilience. And I went, yes, that's an interesting concept. But, you're measuring it to see if people have it and whether they can recover from traumatic events and things like that. And any thoughts about the idea of teaching resilience?
Well, we have a model in our work where, and I can let you have a graphic of that, although I'll have to dig it out, where you move through the 5 dimensions, and a divergence at any one point leads to a malfunction. So yes, resilience can be seen as a process. We very much focus on resilience as a process. Again, going back to the bird analogy, there's a process happening there. You can see the thoughts that are going through the lizard's head. How am I going to get out of this? And you follow through the 5 dimensions. And we know for sure, because it's been done in the military and now in a number of other areas where resilience can be learned. If you think of saying to somebody, well, if you have a negative mindset, you are going to invite a difficulty. If you have a positive mindset, you're going to be able to deal with the situations as they arise. So yes, it can be learned. It can be trained. And well, when we do this research with the Afghan adolescents, the refugees, that's what we'll be trying to do. Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Well, I hate to call this to a close, Denis. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I look forward to speaking to you again, as we talked about before the show. And at this point, I'm just going to sign off with you, and I'm going to do my little ending here, sir. So again, thank you so much. Thank you.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for watching today, and I hope you gained some information that it will be useful to you in the future. As always, please tune in and learn something new here on the Therapy Corner. Have a great day.